You're listening to the Anthem Award-winning podcast from Rutgers Law School, The Power of Attorney. I'm your host and Dean of the Law School, Joanna Bond. It gives me great pleasure today to welcome one of my colleagues at Rutgers Law School, Jorge Contesse. Thank you so much for joining us, Jorge. You have a fascinating history and expertise, and as a fellow human rights scholar and lawyer, I really appreciate the work that you've done in this area. But I want to start with your early history. I know you were born in Chile at a volatile time in its history. Can you please tell us a little bit about your origin story?
Thank you for the invitation. It's exciting to be here. Well, yes, I was born and raised in Chile during the military dictatorship of the infamous Augusto Pinochet. And in my case, it took me a while. My family was not directly involved in politics, so it was really by way of seeing as I was growing up things that were strange, that I could not fully understand that was happening. And the moment when it really kind of dawned on me that something big was going on in the country was by the time that I started in school. I started seeing people, students, new classmates who looked like me, but had I went to French school, and they came mostly from France or similar countries, and they spoke perfectly French, like perfect accent, and it was like something. Why is this person? Why does he look like me? Has a name, has a Chilean name, and his accent is just like he can't really speak Spanish. And that was my first, as a child, kind of understanding that, okay, this is something that's related to those things that I cannot fully understand. And then I started kind of asking questions. And then I understood that these were the children of exilees, people who were returning to the country as the country was opening up and we were somehow leading into the process of transition to democracy. So that was really the big kind of awakening. And then my parents, my mother, she started buying books and literature. So as I was starting to understand sort of the world around me, I started seeing books, in my house, and I just went and I read everything that I could, and that was the kind of the big moment of understanding. Okay, this is what a dictatorship means, and this is what massive human rights violations look like.
What a fascinating story. And I can only imagine the sort of gradual realization of what had happened in the country and what you were seeing around you. Is that what led you to study and teach international human rights law and comparative constitutional law?
I think it is. I mean, it was not conscious, of course. It was what my conscious decision was that I wanted to become a lawyer. I wasn't fully sure why. My intuition was, on the one hand, I thought that the world of litigation and cases and oral arguments was attractive, even though oral arguments was not part of the legal landscape in Chile back in the day. It was much more of like what you see in films. And then it was really combined with this understanding that something really serious was happening and had happened. And that drove me to the world of kind of social justice and human rights. So when I started law school in Chile, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And it was really the effect that full-time professors had on me. I went to a law school in which this was not the rule. It was kind of rare to have a full-time faculty and people who were sort of professional academics, and a law school which has as an ethos human rights and social justice and public interest law. So my interest in litigation kind of started transitioning into an interest in the understanding of the normative parameters and the contours of the law and the study of the law combined with litigation, which was the first work that I do as a clinician, actually. So yes, it's a combination of. I was the first lawyer in my family. I do not come from a family of lawyers, and that was not part of, Sunday lunch conversations. So it was really my kind of self-made understanding of the world and the injustice around me, really, that drove me to this path.
That's fantastic. And I love that you saw the potential in law to really have an impact on the world. What specifically was your path to Rutgers Law School?
So I came to the United States to pursue graduate studies. So I studied law in Chile, and that's 5 years. You have to do another extra year to actually obtain the law degree, which you work kind of it's a professional practice really for like 9 months. So I worked as sort of a junior research assistant or something for a couple of years, 3 years. And then I came to the United States to pursue graduate studies. I stayed here a little longer as a human rights fellow at Fordham, and then I was kind of planning on staying here. And the law school in Chile asked me to return, kind of an emergency. It's like, we need you here, and we need you to run the Human Rights Center. I was like, well, I'm not just ready to go back, but this is really an interesting offer. And so, okay, I'll do it, which means I need to put on hold my JSD dissertation. So I went back to Chile for like 5 years, came back to the United States to finish my dissertation. And while I was in that process, with my idea was to just return, to go back home. And someone here at Rutgers says, Rutgers is looking for someone to teach international human rights and international law. You should send your materials. And I was like, well, I don't even have an updated CV. I'm working on my dissertation. That's like just chapters and memos, and like I don't have, forget about a job doc paper.
Right.
And like I was not considering this. I didn't even like know it was past the deadline of like it was completely out of. And so they insisted. I was like, okay, well, I'm going to send my materials to Rutgers in Newark, and I don't know. I was actively looking for a job because I had already stepped down from my previous law school position in Chile. So I was looking for new places in Chile. And so I sent my materials here, and long story short, I got an interview and then a call back. Like I didn't send my stuff to anywhere else. It was just like this one
Right.
place.
That's
And
great. I love it.
it's yeah, and then well, here I am, 11 years
The
later.
rest is history.
Yep.
Right. Well, it's to our great benefit that
Thank
colleague
you.
mentioned that Rutgers was hiring. I'm so glad that they did. Uh, I have to ask, what was your dissertation on?
On the interaction between international human rights law and domestic constitutional law, looking at the case of indigenous people's rights, so which is a major topic in Chile. So I was working, as a case study, looking at how Chile had ratified a particular international treaty and what that meant in terms of the conversations that take place when you have two different legal orders. One is international, the other one is domestic, which really informed my research for, I would say, a decade.
That's fantastic. Wow. That's great. And let me ask you about teaching for a moment. What's your favorite aspect of being in the classroom and teaching?
That's a great question. I think the way I think about teaching is similar to, I have a friend who is a jazz guitar player. And I tell him that I don't think that our jobs are quite different in the sense that he's working at home, he's practicing, he's rehearsing with his trio, and then he has this major gig or minor, but he has to present, live. And that moment is just that unique moment of live music. That's how I think of teaching. That's how I think of presenting at a conference. But teaching in particular has this thing of you kind of build sort of a relationship that takes place in a room with a group of people, especially first year students, first semester. They're like so thirsty, they're so alert, and so the atmosphere that's created. I always think that there's just one moment, and then the following second, that moment is gone. And I always tell students, think about your legal education. It's just 3 years. You'll be out of this building in 3 years. But next semester, you're going to miss some things that you didn't do while you were sitting in your first semester, and so on. So this is a long response, a long answer. Like is the feeling of the live moment that cannot be repeated, that's just unique, especially when you have those many instances of someone who you're looking at their faces and they're like, I just understood this, right? Like
That light bulb moment.
that light bulb moment of
Yeah.
kind of that building up tension, and then suddenly there's like this click. And it's just such a beautiful, powerful tool that, any professor, any instructor, any teacher really has. I would say that's my favorite kind of part of being in the classroom. Even
That's
in
fantastic.
virtual classrooms, I have to say, I mean, it's not the same.
Right.
But I've taught like fully online courses, and seeing some of the reactions of students who are understanding this new world of online education, which I think I at least do not fully understand. But it's nothing like that live moment, which is comparable to being, at a jazz club.
I love that metaphor of teaching and jazz. That improvisation that happens in both environments
Yeah.
is really wonderful, and that's definitely the most beautiful description of academic discourse I've ever heard. So I love that. Thank you for that. What would you be doing if you weren't teaching? Can you imagine an alternative universe in which you weren't an academic, and what would that look like?
Gosh, the last year of high school, you know that in Latin America, you go straight from high school to law school, which is kind of crazy, I think, for a 17-year-old to know that, oh, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. I think that's just not how it should work. But anyway, that's how it works. But I remember during my last year of high school, I kind of knew for a while that I wanted to go to law school when I was in high school. But then during my last year, I had a moment of maybe I do want to pursue music. I like music. I like playing music, but just like an amateur. But I thought maybe this is something that I could do, because I couldn't think of anything else really. I couldn't think of, oh, this is another career that it was very clear that I wanted to do something related to this space. And again, there's a connection. I think there's an interesting connection in how we think of our profession, and how musicians think of their. So, because I cannot think of anything else really, that's what I would say. But it's hard for me to think outside of not even being a lawyer. Like when I finish my studies in Chile, you have to take this exam, and one of the professors who took actually he was the constitutional law professor. So after the exam, he and I, we run into each other on the street, and he says, at my office, and we can talk about what your plans are. And I remember I was wearing a Jimi Hendrix T-shirt after my exam. So it's like, just make sure you dress up, okay? Because this is an actual law firm. So don't come like this. And I went there, and I remember, so he was sort of introducing me to the work in the office. It was really very impressive, all this, modern law firm. And at some point, I says, okay, so he wanted me to join the firm. And he says, this would be great. Look at this, it's fantastic. And I remember asking, so what did you do today? Like to understand what you do. I mean, he's been talking for an hour, but what did you actually do today? And he says very proudly, well, we just purchased a bank. And I remember thinking, that was the moment when I said, okay, this is exactly what I don't want to do. Like, I don't want to go home
Right.
and tell someone, guess what I did today? I bought a bank.
That's an important realization
It
about
was
what
very
you do
important.
and don't want
It was very
professionally.
important, yes. In fact, I ended up working with him, but as a research assistant on a project that was really interesting on, the right to privacy and the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court of Chile on the right to privacy. and I understood very clearly, this is what I like. This is really what I like.
Right.
So I've been really fortunate, even as a young lawyer, and then, coming here, I feel very privileged, really, that I can do
That's
what I do.
wonderful. That's great. Very quickly, what instrument do you play? Or do you play multiple instruments? Or
I
do you
do
sing?
play. I mean, my instrument is the guitar. That's
Ah,
what I play. But I know how to, juggle with other things here and there.
that's fantastic. That's great. I love it. You're the founding director of the Center for Transnational Law here at Rutgers, of which we are very proud. Uh, how did it come about, and what's the purpose of the center?
The center is, I have to give credit to our colleague Suzanne Kim, because she pushed the idea. I had joined the law school, I had been here for just a couple of years, maybe 3 years, and she says you should consider doing something you have such an interest in international law and comparative law. There's nothing really here, and you could use my center, her center, on sexuality and gender as kind of a hub. And she was like, I can offer you this platform if this is something that you would be interested in. And that felt like, okay, I can't say no to this. This is really, an interesting idea to explore. And so that's what I did. So for a few years, I got some funding from the chancellor's office, and I was able to set up this initiative. It was a transnational legal initiative. And then a few years, just a couple of years later, maybe, it was upgraded to transnational law. And the idea was, there's so much interest and experience and expertise that's kind of disseminated here in the law school, uh, from both faculty and students. So we really need something that can kind of gather and bring this interest and views and expertise together. And that's how the center that was the idea behind the center, having a permanent institutional platform where people who share interests on international law and comparative law, whether it's human rights, taxation, international commercial law, can sort of meet and kind of encounter and develop projects and initiatives. So that's the big idea behind it, like having this hub for Rutgers Law School, where people who share these interests can kind of interact.
That's fantastic. Well, as someone who shares those interests, I'm very excited that
Yep.
that it
And
exists.
I'm very happy that you're one of the faculty affiliates among many other of
Thank
our
you.
colleagues.
Thank you. I know that our students benefit tremendously through association with the center, and some of them are able to take advantage of study and work abroad through the center. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the center funds summer internships for those students who have an interest in being exposed to other, not just countries, but really legal cultures. I mean, you yourself have done this. You've gone to other places, spent time kind of, trying to understand the legal system,
Right.
and it makes you a better lawyer. Your thinking is only more complex and sophisticated when you've been exposed to how other people do things and think about similar things, about the same problems. I always do this when I'm teaching, I don't know, first year criminal law, and I bring my understanding of civil law jurisdictions, and I see how students appreciate this. And so for them to have the opportunity to actually work with local partners, NGOs doing, social justice work or human rights work, in Latin America. Now that I'm a member of the UN Committee Against Torture, I'm hoping to expand this into the world of the United Nations. It's such a great opportunity for students, and I can, there's so much that I can do. I wish I could do even more, because there's so much interest. They want to understand the world. They want to be exposed to other cultures, to other legal, thinking, and the center just tries to do that by supporting students to do that kind of work.
Well, I'm so happy that you mentioned your appointment to the Committee Against Torture. That is something that we here at Rutgers are so proud of. It's really one of the most prestigious roles in international human rights law. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your work with the committee and how that came about and what it looks like on a annual basis.
Sure. And the first thing that I'll say, because we're on the record, is I want to acknowledge your support, and I'm it's at some point that it was so good that you are the dean. I didn't have to explain to you because you've done work and research on treaty bodies and UN treaty
Right,
bodies. So it's not like, let me explain to you this weird animal that we call a human rights treaty body.
right.
So that's what the Committee Against Torture is. There are major human rights treaties in the United Nations, and each one of these treaties has its own kind of supervisory body. And what they do and what the Committee Against Torture does is this is a 10-member committee that meets 3 times a year in Geneva to engage in dialogues with states that are parties to the Convention Against Torture. And under that convention, they have an obligation to report periodically to basically explain how they are complying with their obligations under the convention. And so what we do is we meet with them, with state delegations. We look at the reports. We look at reports from other sources, such as civil society organizations, and we interact. We ask questions, we gather information, and then we make recommendations on how, in our view, the state can do better when it comes to implementing the convention. So that's one part of the work. And the other major part is individual communications. So individuals who, for example, face deportation to a country where they fear they may be tortured or subject to ill treatment, they can come before the committee and ask for the committee to review that case. If we believe that there are in fact grounds, reasonable grounds to believe that that person may be subject to torture or ill treatment, then we will request the state not to deport, not to extradite that particular person. That's in 1 minute what we do. And yeah, well, now that students are working with me actively, and my plan is to expand the work that students can actually do with the committee.
You and I have talked a little bit about that. And as you know, I'm so excited about expanding opportunities for students to be involved in this work.
Yeah.
Because it is such important work. It's transformative for the people involved. And for students to actually see what human rights work looks like up close, I think is really an unusual opportunity. So thank you for continuing to think creatively about involving our students in this. It's such a rare opportunity. I want to ask a little bit about your scholarly work. I know you present at conferences quite a bit and organize conferences here at the law school. Can you tell us a little bit about why it's so important to collaborate with other scholars and practitioners in both research and sort of the practical issues of human rights that come up?
I think the answer to the question is really embedded in your question. If you're working on human rights, if you're thinking about international law, if you're thinking of any of these topics, I couldn't think of being a good scholar without integrating, into the conversation the ways in which those human rights standards and those rules and norms and doctrines are being implemented or not implemented. And that means, of course, having conscious interactions and conversations with folks on the ground, but certainly with people who are in other places. To me, it's just inherent in the work that I do. Maybe if my area was something different, I wouldn't feel. I'm not sure that I would, but maybe I would not feel as compelled as I do about engaging with folks who are in other places. So having conferences and going to conferences and organizing things here so that, once again, the community can engage with and have exposure to how people in other places think about things. I mean, one problem that we have here in the United States is really that we're too quick to think that this is how things, are done, and that's it. And I'm glad that that's not the sort of the prevailing thinking at Rutgers. Once again, the Center for Transnational Law kind of realizes there are so many people who already think that it's important to engage in comparative analysis and who are actually coming from other places. So that's just part of, to me, it's natural, it's organic to, with people who are in other places, to try to understand how other jurisdictions think about the same problems that we face. And once again, to see how how international law can have an effect on our domestic conversations.
That's brilliant. And it really does break down this kind of insular view of the world from a US perspective. What legal accomplishment are you most proud of? Well, let me change that and say what legal, professional, or scholarly accomplishment are you most proud of?
Oh, I think I I don't know, probably I should say being elected by the state parties to the UN Convention Against Torture. That's an incredible thing, and I'm very proud of. But at the same time, I'm very proud of when I started working as a very young lawyer, and we were, thinking of cases to bring in the Human Rights Clinic in Chile, and we would just think so hard, like, here's a victim, how can we, do something about this? And I feel very proud of being a young lawyer and having that interest and motivation. And it's to me, it's like it's not different from what I'm doing now, 20 years later. There's once again, this is coming from a band that I like, but it's really coming from sort of like people only change to become more like themselves. And I think that's also how I see, my young self, 20 years, even 30 years as a student, thinking about these same issues without fully understanding what they mean and how they can be implemented. And now being a scholar and a full-time member here at the law school, the faculty, and thinking about the same issues with a much, richer understanding and sort of an attitude to work on the same issues. So both as a young lawyer and now as I don't know if I'm a senior person, but someone who has already done a few things that I feel as proud as I was when I was 20 something.
That's wonderful. I love the idea of thinking about this as an evolution of what was really a core aspect of your identity, the focus on social justice and how that sort of carried through your career and now manifests in slightly different ways as a more senior professional, but that thread runs all the way through your career. And that's just fantastic. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Before we wrap up, Jorge, let me just ask you, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I mean, there's so much, but there's just it's like 1 minute, right?
We just have a minute. That's right.
I'm just grateful, and I think this is a good opportunity to, in a conversation with you, as the dean, someone who is really leading the law school, and I'm grateful, being part of this community for the things that we do, for the things that we stand for. There's so much work that needs to be done, especially when you're an international lawyer and we're living in these times. And just to be a reminder of where, our ethos and the things that we have done, so that once again, that informs and kind of illuminates the places and the things that we want to do, the places we want to go, the places we want to, the things that we want to achieve really as a community, as a law school. So thank you for being the leader of this project, and looking forward for I think, wherever it's coming, that it needs to be better than what we've already done.
Well, I appreciate that. And I share your sense of gratitude to be part of this community that is really devoted to thinking about how the law impacts the lives of real people. And that is sort of in the institutional DNA of the law school. So you're very much a central part of that. And I'm so grateful too to have you as a colleague. But lastly, grateful for you to come on this podcast and talk with us about your incredible experience. So thank you very much for joining us, Jorge, and really appreciate the conversation. Take care.
Thank you, you too.
The Power of Attorney is a production of Rutgers Law School. With 2 locations just minutes from New York City and Philadelphia, Rutgers Law offers the prestige and reputation of a large, nationally known university with a personal, small campus experience. Learn more today by visiting us at law.rutgers.edu.